Good morning. My name is Leila Zia. I'm one of the general chairs of the Web Conference 2019, head of research at Wikimedia Foundation, and co-president of Web for Good, which organizes this conference. I hope you all enjoyed the past few days. If you were with us this morning, we are going to have a keynote presentation. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I just want to say a few schedule logistical points about the rest of today. Today is Friday. We are going to start with the keynote. We're going to go to coffee break. The first coffee break of the day will happen as usual downstairs. So just go one floor down in the exhibitor space. Then we're going to have the research tracks. And in parallel to that, we are going to have designing an ethical web, which is the special track of the day. We're going to have lunch. It's usual lunch. Today is sunny. We started with sun on Monday. We're going to end with hopefully sun on Friday. Enjoy the lunch outside. And then when we come back from lunch, again, as usual, posters and demos, they're going to be downstairs in the expo hall. Parallel to that, we have designing an ethical web running in Garden AB. Coffee break will happen same time, but you're not going to go to Pacific Concourse Expo Hall, so just come here outside Grand Ballroom. And the coffee breaks will take place here because at that time, Expo Hall, they're going to wrap it up. And then we will come back to this room at 4 p.m. There's going to be a panel, and then the closing ceremony and awards for best papers, best posters. Actually, I am reminded that there is one thing else happening right after this, our keynote today, which is in this same room. We're going to ask all of you to come to the center of the room as much as possible and as close as possible to the stage. We are going to have a group photo. So please help with that, cooperate with us at that point. We stop at 10 and we're going to have literally 5 minutes to make it work. So help us as much as you can. You're going to be sitting on the chairs, but we will just need you to come center forward. And if you have red lanyards, please make sure you are not in the photo or take off your red lanyard before joining us in the photo. Okay, so with this, I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today. Claire Wardle is our keynote. She is a TED Fellow. She leads strategic direction and research at First Data. She's the co-founder of Eyewitness Media Hub. Before First Draft, Claire was the director of research at Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. She has years of experience in the area of journalism. She was the head of social media for United Nations Refugee Agency. We are delighted to have Claire today because over the past days, we have been talking about what it takes to have an open web, a web that is trustworthy, that is balanced, and that can represent the people that are behind this web, their cultures, their information, and their knowledge. And Claire is going to talk with us today about a participatory project that she's putting together with a group of people, which is going to do exactly that. So the project is aiming to bring an information commons, create an information commons that represents the world that we live in, not only a minority or of this world or only part of the knowledge of this world, but also an information commons that is reliable and that is trustworthy. And it holds accountable to those who create the knowledge and disseminate the knowledge in this information commons. With this introduction, please help me in welcoming Claire Wardle.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here and having the opportunity to talk to you. And thank you to Leila and the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity. And so, as Leila said, I'm going to talk about enlisting the public to build a healthier information commons. But I want to start here, which is, imagine 9/11 if it happened today. I'm sure you recall this iconic image of crowds of people simply standing and staring, watching in horror as the smoke billowed out of the towers. But imagine that same scene if everyone was holding a smartphone. We can imagine what that would look like today. So if it happened today, technology would change everything. Rumors and misinformation would be speeding across the social networks. People would be live streaming from the top of the towers. Hate-filled messages aimed at the Muslim community would be everywhere. The outrage amplified by algorithms responding to unprecedented levels of shares, comments, and likes. And foreign agents would amplify the division, driving wedges between different communities. I know that you know this. You're probably the most sophisticated audience I've ever spoken to when it comes to these issues. But I wanted to start with an example to underline how much has changed in such a short amount of time. The changes to our information ecosystem have been incredibly rapid, and we, governments, tech companies, and civil society, are now looking for fixes that can match the speed of this change, but that's leading us on some dangerous paths and yet more unintended consequences. And that is what I want to focus on today. How can we take a deep breath and think about ways we can adapt to our new reality rather than thinking we can solve anything? In less than 2 decades, we've seen the explosive growth of mobile technology, the collapsing costs of mobile data, the dominance of a handful of corporations that govern unprecedented amounts of speech globally, and the decline of gatekeepers. News outlets are struggling financially, but more critically, the days of loyal audiences have disappeared as people turn to algorithmic feeds and search results to show them the news of the day. And these shifts, as you know, have had major implications, the scale of which we can't even get our heads around, and certainly not our hands. The fact that these corporations are private means that we just can't access data in order to properly understand this new reality. They have so much impact on our public sphere, yet we are powerless to really understand how it's working. So when we look at the information commons, it's broken. We proudly live in the information age, yet the central currency of this age is no longer considered entirely trustworthy or credible. We like to say we live in the information age, yet who here hasn't received a text message from a friend saying, "Sorry to bother you, it's just that crazy Uncle Bob yet again has posted something in the family Facebook Messenger group, and I don't know if it's true or not, can you help?" We can't be proud of that reality in 2019. And while an alien visiting from Mars might be forgiven for thinking that misinformation started the day after the US presidential election in November 2016, those who were monitoring information on social media had seen this coming, particularly those working internationally. My background, I've been working with newsrooms to figure out how to verify content on the social web. I helped develop the BBC's online training course about verifying material on the social web. And around 2009, we were basically establishing techniques for how to verify the video of Nader, who was killed in Iran. We actually were working on the rumors around Hurricane Sandy in 2012, verifying chemical weapons attacks in Syria in 2013, the Philippines election in May 2016, and more personally, the Brexit referendum the month afterwards. There is no doubt, however, that while this is not new, it's happening at a scale that's difficult to even imagine, let alone start thinking about interventions. 10 years ago, when I was training those BBC journalists, I was training them to be wary of this guy, Tommaso De Benedetto, an Italian who liked to impersonate famous people on Twitter. This was all we had to worry about back then. Or I was warning BBC journalists about Wikipedia edits that might mean they described a music festival as starting its life with the names Wanky Balls Festival. So this was actually a newspaper, The Independent, a well-known newspaper in the UK, and it got hoaxed by a Wikipedia edit. Seriously, these were blissful times in comparison to where we are today. We're facing unprecedented challenges connected to information quality. But before we go any further, let's just have a quick chat about language. Our language is so horribly muddled when it comes to talking about these challenges. That's a polite way of me saying, why on earth are we still using the term F***** news? It's extraordinarily unhelpful, covering multiple things that are just not the same. Lies, rumors, hoaxes, misinformation, conspiracies, propaganda. And more importantly, we have to stop using a phrase that's been co-opted by politicians right around the world, from the left and the right, used as a weapon to attack a free and independent press. Because we need our professional news media now more than ever. And besides, most of this content doesn't even masquerade as news. It appears as memes, videos, and social posts. Too much of this conversation is focused on text and URLs. And yes, this is part of the problem, but our ability to parse text and analyze it through NLP has disproportionately skewed our research and solutions to text. Images, memes, and videos, not just deepfakes, are what we should be worried about. And through the work that we did at First Draft, monitoring misinformation in Brazil and Nigeria, I'm also now obsessed with audio messages. Again, not deepfakes, just voice memos that people leave via WhatsApp, old school rumors left by your friend and reshared. Audio, the most authentic communication medium available. Someone you trust is telling you a story, and it's likely that you'll believe it. And most of it is not fake, it's misleading. We fixate on what's true or false, but my biggest concern is actually the weaponization of context. Because the most effective disinformation has always been that which has a kernel of truth to it. Back in 2017, frustrated by the term F*** news, I began, because it was being used to describe everything and nothing, I worked out this typology as a starting point for the first misinfocon at MIT lab in January 2017. I did this on a Sunday in my pajamas. It was based on the work I'd been doing for the decades before, most of which had been about videos and images, and the typology reflects that. I wanted people to understand that these problems were complex and there was a spectrum. From satire, that of course is not misinformation when created, but is increasingly used by agents of disinformation around the world, knowing that it will be shared, and after a while, people won't see it as satire. They'll start to believe it. Another reason to label something satire is so that fact checkers don't touch it. And this is an actual technique that we're seeing happening globally. At the other end of the scale, we have the truly 100% fabricated content. But really, the most concerning content is in the middle, that which is misleading. As a side note, any designers in the room, please make friends with other people. This was actually my first attempt at the slide, and somebody tweeted it from MisinfoCon. It got picked up by Brian Stelter and appeared on CNN with this horrific background. So I just wanted to shout out to designers that we need you more than ever. I then wrote a report with Hossein Darakshan where we published this Venn diagram, explaining the difference between mis, dis, and malinformation. And we looked at two factors, falsity and harm. So misinformation is something that's false and could cause harm, but the person sharing that content doesn't realize it's false. So my mum resharing this shark photo during a hurricane is an example of misinformation. Disinformation is also false, but the person creating or sharing realizes it's false and is sharing it to cause harm. Russian operatives creating events on Facebook that are both pro and anti-immigration are examples of this. We also created the term malinformation, used to describe genuine information, but the sharing of this information is designed to cause harm. This might be the leaking of emails or sharing personal images of a sexual nature, otherwise known as revenge porn. We also talked about the different elements, trying to break down the agents' messages and how they were interpreted. Some agents are motivated by financial gain, some by political influence, either domestic or foreign, and some are motivated by social or psychological factors. They just want to cause mischief or even trouble, and mostly they just want to feel connected to a wider group. And finally, we talked about the different phases of information disorder to highlight how dynamic this space is. Whoever is creating a message and their motivation shifts as it's published and redistributed, often with new framing messages. So I'll be honest, it was basically an 80-page report that said, this is hard and complex, but here's some typologies and diagrams to make us all feel better. But we do have to grab onto this complexity. I'm increasingly comparing this to pollution and thinking about this as a health context. Many different types, many different harms, global in scale and influence. With something this complex, terminology matters, granularity matters. We all have to agree on what we're actually talking about. So let's think about the word harm. We use the word harm, but what do we mean when we say that? Full Fact, a UK fact-checking organisation, came out with their pagoda of harms. They wanted us to recognise that the fact that the shark on the highway exists, it might be annoying, but it's not harming anyone. That is distinct from the kind of dangerous speech that has risk to life, either because it's radicalising people or it's causing a public health crisis, as we currently have with vaccinations globally. We're disproportionately focused on political disinformation, particularly in the US, but can we start focusing our attention in places where we can see concrete real-world harms? So, getting the language bit out of the way, I want to provide a foundation of why this is so complex. I think that there are 5 interlocking issues, and then I'm going to suggest how we, as a wider community, might start working on these challenges by bringing in the public. So first, we don't have a rational relationship to information. We have an emotional one. It's simply not true that more facts will make everything okay. The algorithms that the platforms use to determine what content we see are designed to reward our emotional responses. When people are fearful, which they increasingly are, oversimplified narratives, conspiratorial explanations, and messages that demonize others become far more effective. And since the business model for so many of these platforms is attached to attention, the algorithms will always be skewed towards emotion. I know it's tempting for our community, researchers, journalists, and technologists to think about more nutritional labels, flags, and credibility scores. That's what we need. But we're in this mess because people connect with information that supports and reinforces their identity. When we share on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, it's about performing our identity. The public nature of these sites means that we have to recognize this element. People want to share content that reinforces an idea about the type of person they want to seem to be. Most of the speech we're discussing is legal. I'm not talking here about child sexual abuse imagery or content that incites violence. It can be perfectly legal to post an outright lie. People talk all the time about taking down problematic or harmful content, but no one can agree on clear definitions. And that includes Mark Zuckerberg, who recently called for global regulations to help moderate speech. My fear, and it is a real fear, is that right now, governments around the world are making hasty policy decisions that could trigger other, more serious, long-term consequences for our speech. Here's a dynamic map of government interventions to date that Pointer manages. It's updated by the amazing Daniel Funke, who you should really follow if you care about these issues and how they're affecting people globally. Already, there are almost 50 of these around the world, from threats to very problematic legislation. It's easy to nod when you hear someone talk about problematic content, as if it's clear, but I want us to look at some examples and remember that the real threat is the weaponization of context. Here's an example from London from March 2017, a tweet that circulated in the aftermath of a terrorist incident on Westminster Bridge. This is a genuine image, not fake. It was shared widely using an Islamophobic framing with a number of hashtags, including Ban Islam. The woman in the photograph was interviewed afterwards, and she explained that she was utterly traumatized, on the phone to a loved one, and out of respect, not looking at the victim. Now, if you were moderating Twitter on that day, would you take it down or would you leave it up? My gut reaction, my emotional reaction, is to take this down. I hate the framing of this image, but freedom of expression is a human right. If we start taking down speech that makes us uncomfortable, we're in trouble. And while this example might seem clear-cut to you, and it does to me, it makes me feel very uncomfortable, most speech isn't, and the lines are incredibly hard to draw. A well-meaning decision by one person is outright censorship to the next. What we now know is that this account, Texas Lone Star, was part of a Russian disinformation campaign, one that has since been shut down. Would that change your view? Well, it would change mine, because now it's part of a coordinated scheme to sow discord. Here's another example that a former colleague, Cameron Hickey, flagged to me. Let's read it together for a second. Illegal aliens are far more likely to commit federal crimes based on statistics. They are 7% of the population, yet they commit 72% of drug possession, 33% of money laundering, and so on and so on. If you're from the left, you're probably automatically thinking that this is false. If you're from the right, you may be thinking, great, when are we going to build that wall? These statistics are factually correct. The issue is the word federal. Most US crime is state crime. It becomes federal when a border is involved, so these numbers with context make more sense. But if you fact check this, it would need a true stamp over the top. We don't have a way of communicating this type of nuance effectively. Here's another. This is a genuine video from the lead up to the midterms in the US. A woman went into a voting booth, and when she tried to click a candidate's name, the other name popped up. She had explained what had happened. They took the machine out of service, and she was able to vote. Essentially, no real harm happened, but this was pushed through conspiracy networks, including QAnon networks, and as a result, this was pushed very, very widely with this framing of you can't vote, you can't trust the voting system. Facebook took it down immediately, saying it was connected to election integrity. Twitter took longer, stating it was a genuine video. Once they realized the coordinated piece of the campaign that had been unearthed, they took it down. But I want to use these examples just to show how difficult this is. And finally, to Brazil, where we worked on a collaborative journalism project there called Comprova. And we had a central WhatsApp number, which over 250,000 messages were sent to us from Brazilians asking whether something was true or false. This was the most shared image that we received, and it's a genuine photo of ballots being moved to the location. There's nothing untoward, although it's not great that it's out on the back of a truck. But the rumor that circulated with this image on WhatsApp was that it had been pre-flagged for her dad, Bolsonaro's opponent. And so one of the reasons I show these examples is because I worry that too many people believe that artificial intelligence is going to solve these issues. And I think we can all agree that we're a long way away from having AI sophisticated enough to make sense of social visual posts like this. And while we're talking about AI, allow me a couple of minutes to discuss deepfakes. Yes, they're scary, but honestly, I'm much more worried about the kind of effective misleading content I've just shown you. And also things like this. This was the Jim Acosta video, where a minor edit to speed up the video and to remove a spoken apology made the CNN correspondent look like he was acting aggressively towards an aide. This was pushed out by the White House. It wasn't a deep fake. It was most certainly a shallow fake. And this video we've seen pop up in 5 different elections around the world. It purports to be an immigrant beating up a nurse. This video is when it happened during the French election. And on the right, this is when it appeared in the Spanish election, and Maldito Bullo fact-checked it, showing that the original video was actually from Russia. Or this CCTV footage, which was incorrectly shared after a terrorist incident in Brussels. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. By the time it appears on a small phone screen, any nuance goes out of the window. And if it reinforces your existing fears, prejudices, or worldview, you're much more likely to believe it. And yes, there is a worry that a supposed deep fake of a candidate emerges the night before an election and swings things. But that risk already exists. So yes, we have to be prepared for AI-powered synthetic media, but we also have to remember what tools we already have. We have television archives that include older speeches and public appearances to cross-check whether someone really did say something at a given time. We have amazing technology built by researchers to automatically assess blood flow, so you know that this video of Barack Obama isn't true. Or the blockchain technology newsrooms are now working on so they can protect their own visual imagery. I believe we're still 4 years out from a deep fake that could really fool us. And my hope is that by that time, we'll have our own weapons to counter the threat. Because I'll tell you, there's nothing like watching what amazing journalists and human rights investigators can do when it comes to verifying something like a YouTube video purporting to show a chemical weapons attack in Syria, when there are no journalists on the ground. You watch them cross-reference evidence from doctors and eyewitnesses on WhatsApp, geolocate images using satellite image and shadow analysis. They verify the distance of a bomb using audio forensics. We're already doing some of the most incredible verification of videos. And if you're interested, this example from the New York Times is just one of them. So next time someone tries to terrify you about deepfakes, stay calm and say we're on it, because the fear-mongering is actually causing the real harm. It's the liar's dividend. The fact that if a piece of audio comes out about a candidate, they can already dismiss it as a deep fake. It's this liar's dividend we should really be worried about, not the technology itself. Even if we could figure out what to keep up or take down, we've never had so much speech. Every second, people around the world upload millions of pieces of content in multiple languages, drawing on thousands of different cultural contexts. We just don't have effective systems for moderating content at this scale, whether powered by humans or by technology. And I'm sure many of you have seen this video, but when you see these Chinese click farms, you recognize how difficult it is to even handle this kind of content at the scale that we're working on. Yes, we see these in China and Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, fourth, humans have a dark side. Few in Silicon Valley ever anticipated that mass shooters would live stream their massacres. Very few newsrooms thought about how they would be targeted and manipulated to amplify the flawed ideologies driving some of these shooters. Few considered how the fundamental architecture of Facebook, the ability to target ads, would be weaponized by Russian trolls, or that cyborgs in some of our poorest countries would be paid to hit publish thousands of times a day to emulate bot-like behavior. And few foresaw conspiracy theorists building sizable audiences around fringe beliefs on YouTube. And few predicted that beautiful images of lattes and sunrises would end up losing out to outrage memes on Instagram. But why would anybody think about the dark side of human nature? Silicon Valley believed that their technologies would counteract hate. Connection would drive understanding and therefore tolerance. There's no one factor that has caused these challenges, yet some of them are technical, yes. but much of this is driven by social, political, and economic factors. We too often fail to examine the underlying societal shifts that are making people more susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy. Trust in institutions is falling because of major political and economic upheaval, most notably ever-widening income inequality. The rise of automation is making fearful for their jobs. Global migration trends are making people concerned that their communities will change. The effects of climate change are becoming more pronounced around the world, putting homes and investments at risk. As I said earlier, when people are fearful, and they increasingly are, oversimplified narratives, conspiratorial explanations, and messages that demonize others have become far more effective. So finally, I know this is the web conference, but we also need to acknowledge that the web is part of a wider information ecosystem. We like to lay all the blame at the feet of the tech companies, but the mass media and elected officials too often play an equal role in amplifying rumors and conspiracies. And those of us who use these platforms also play a role in adding to the pollution when we choose to share misleading or divisive content. This is my trumpet of amplification. It's based on work by the likes of Whitney Phillips, Joan Donovan, Ben Decker, Rennie DeResta, but was designed as a simple diagram that newsrooms would take notice of. It illustrates how so many of these rumors start in dark corners of the web, for example, 4chan, 8chan, Discord, then moves through the ecosystem via closed messaging apps like Twitter, DM groups, WhatsApp groups, Telegram, then moves on to conspiracy networks on platforms like Reddit, YouTube, and Gab. From there, it gets pushed into Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and too often, it then gets picked up by the mainstream media. Not that because they don't look backwards, they think it's just appeared there. And as we know, sometimes when it appears in the professional media, it then gets picked up by certain politicians, and it then gets picked up by the media again. So understanding this wider network and understanding how all of this connected is one of the things that we're not doing at the moment. And when we look to platforms to self-regulate, they are thinking about solutions and interventions for just their platform. We have to think about this in the wider sense. So this technological and social change has happened so quickly, none of us can keep up, let alone researchers, policymakers, and educators. We are well and truly over our skis. And I know we're all looking for an easy fix, but there just isn't one. For the past 3 years, I, like many of you, have probably gone to over 100 panels and convenings on this subject right around the world. I know we've been trying to figure this out, but from my experience, you either leave an hour-long panel so depressed you want to drink something very, very strong, or you leave a 2-day workshop with a ton of Google Docs and Post-its that nobody wants to throw away, but everybody goes back to their day jobs and nothing gets implemented. Any solution will need to be implemented at a massive scale, internet scale. The major tech companies operate at that level, but can and should they fix this themselves? They're certainly trying, but most of us, including the platforms, don't want global corporations to be the guardians of truth and fairness online. Similarly, the platforms are working to improve their own platforms, not the wider ecosystem. What is their incentive to do that? Facebook's third-party fact-checking project is admirable, but Facebook is paying fact-checkers around the world to essentially build the biggest database of online misinformation, but one that only they can access. Shouldn't YouTube, Pinterest, Reddit, and other researchers have the same access? And at the moment, the tech companies are marking their own homework. They tell us their interventions are working, but because they write their own transparency reports, it's impossible to verify what is actually happening. Often, major changes to the platforms come only after a journalist uncovers bias or content that breaks community guidelines. The tech companies have a very important part to play, but they cannot control the process. And so what about the government? Those who call for regulation of the platforms seem to see it as the best hope of cleaning up the information ecosystem. But lawmakers are finding it tough to keep up with the rapid changes in online and digital technology. More important, they have little access to data about what is on these platforms. Besides, which government would we trust to do this? We need global, not national responses. So the missing link is us, I believe, the people who use these technologies every day. When conversations turn to the public, it tends to just be about media literacy, and too often a paternalistic framing of a public where people just need to be taught how to be smarter consumers of information. But is there a way that we can rebuild an infrastructure that supports quality information? It feels to me that we're like one huge family trying to solve the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle. We've just about found the 4 corner pieces, and we're slowly building out the 4 edges as we define these challenges. The jigsaw puzzle is going to take us at least 30 years, if not more, if not ever, and our rush for quick fixes is actually slowing us down. And the truth is that we should stop talking about solutions. This is about building ongoing resiliency for a new reality. because we simply don't have the structures in place to work effectively. For a problem of this size and complexity, we would normally have a global body, and my dream would be that it would effectively include the public in the process. But if we had a UN agency for disinformation, I don't think that would happen. I believe what we need is an independent body that can identify, design, and facilitate the building of potential solutions in cooperation with the brightest minds in technology, policy, and journalism. All of this should be informed by insights and experiences collected from the global public. Because if we want an information commons based on verifiability, one that is held accountable and one that is truly representative of the global society, everyone has a part to play in solving this jigsaw puzzle. So what could we actually do? If we want to bring in the public, of course, Wikipedia has shown us what can be possible. It's not perfect, but it's demonstrated that with the right structures, a global outlook, and lots of transparency, you can build something that will earn most people's trust. And we have to tap into the collective wisdom and experience of all users, especially people of color, women, and groups that are underrepresented. They are the experts in disinformation and hate because they have been the targets of these campaigns online for a very long time. But when they've raised flags over the years, they've too often been ignored. This has to change. So what if we came up with a dramatically new, deliberative process that involves a global community of concerned citizens ready to share information and participate to improve our information commons? There are 4 ways that I'd love to see the public involved. 1, providing personal insight, to have a way for people to share their experiences of particular issues, not just opinions. Secondly, to donate data and share tips. I first heard David Lazar talk about this back in February 2017. And he was arguing that we're never going to get data from the platforms. And he was saying, how do we get people to donate their social data to science? Thirdly, to join a micro-volunteerism effort. This is personally my favorite thing in the world. I love that volunteers do all of these tiny tasks like mapping our solar systems, tagging satellite imagery, tagging artifacts in museum storage, making new discoveries out in the wild. And every day the work that gets done on Wikipedia is eye-watering to me. And finally, taking part in experiments. Nathan Matthias and his organization Civil Servant have inspired so many wonderful conversations about running experiments on these platforms, and he has worked on Wikipedia and Reddit. So let's take each one of these. This image is about a massive consultation the UN did in the lead up to the Sustainable Development Goals. It was an ambitious attempt to get feedback from the global public, both offline and on. There are some very interesting models that exist out there and many lessons to learn. But doing this well is very difficult. Back in 2007, I wrote a report for the BBC about user-generated content. It was all about who were these people who contacted the BBC via email or text? Why did they do it? One of the biggest findings was if you ask people, what do you think? Most people don't believe they know enough to contribute. But if you ask them what they know, you get incredibly useful responses. People are experts of their own experiences. But we have utterly failed to tap into that knowledge and expertise when it comes to these issues globally. So many of the problems have been caused because these tech companies were founded here on the west coast of the US by really well-meaning people, but most of them had led very sheltered and pretty privileged lives. The technology they have built is now used by billions of people around the world living in countries with complex ethnic and religious constructs, deep socioeconomic challenges, histories of war, conflict, and colonialism. Countries that almost none of these engineers have visited. What if we created a truly global platform where the lived experiences and concerns of people could be reflected back, where cultural and political context and complexity could be explained in real time, where the abuse of images to fan the flames of hatred towards the Rohingya in Myanmar would not have come as a surprise, when the violence-related WhatsApp messages could have been explained and potentially predicted through the lens of religious tension in India over decades. When we take this historical landscape of religious tension and layer on a population when many people via phones that they're only now experiencing digital technology for the first time, it's much less surprising that we're seeing the spread of rumors fueling real-world violence. I'm also obsessed with understanding which aspects of technology people are really concerned about. Is it vaccine information? Is it hate speech? Is it news credibility? Is it deepfakes? Is it algorithmic bias? Is it addiction? I think there's a mismatch between what we're studying and building solutions around and that which most concerns the global public. So this is a screenshot of the Facebook political ad collector that ProPublica built. It's no longer working because Facebook changed the API, but it was an attempt to get people to install a plugin so they could collect data about the ads people were seeing on their feed. Lots of lessons learned that underscore that we need to build a centralized open repository of anonymized data with privacy and ethical standards at the core. Right now, everyone has a personal experience on these platforms, and that makes it impossible for us to know what information people are really seeing. It's impossible for us to run these audits. Could we build an ambitious crowd-powered platform that would allow users to provide insights, donate their data to science, provide tips about what people are seeing around the world to act as an early warning system, weigh in on difficult moderation decisions, and give feedback about changes that would affect the information users see? Right now, I'm a fellow at TED, working alongside Alexios Mantsalis, who some of you may know. He helped to found the International Fact-Checking Network. The work that we're doing is all about bringing the public into these conversations and to make them partners in the interventions being developed. These are very early days, so we don't yet have a community to draw on, but we wanted to explore what it would look like if we collected experiences from the public. So we used the platform Lucid to get people in 12 countries to send screenshots from Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Google. We asked them to search using the search string, "Should I vaccinate my child?" We expected to get rude pictures, I'm not going to lie, but we actually got amazingly rich data. Here you can see examples of what you see if you search vaccines on Instagram. These are just 4 of the countries that we looked at. But as you can see, #vaccines kill, vaccines uncovered. There was a lot of pretty bad content on Instagram around the world. And secondly, on Facebook, you can see here we asked people to search specifically so we could compare, should I vaccinate my child? And here's an example of a page. I wanted to highlight this because it goes to show the power of emotional and individual experience. People here are sharing their personal stories of their children. Facts don't work when you have images of children who appear to have had terrible reactions to vaccinations. It's such a powerful case study for us to learn how to counter personal, emotional narratives effectively. And as you see, they're talking about peer review. When you spend time in these communities, they share images of binders and binders of evidence. This isn't about people needing more information. It's about understanding what's driving these communities. And this is another interesting example. The same article was getting featured in a top snippet on Google search, but different paragraphs were being chosen. One is paragraph 11 and one is paragraph 12. One is a solid description of why to vaccinate, but the next one supports vaccine hesitancy and explains the times when it doesn't make sense for a baby to be vaccinated. Fine with context, but a snippet doesn't have the wider context. And in an era as we move into voice-activated technology and you only have one answer when you ask Alexa, I'm particularly concerned about what we can do around snippets. And we also asked people with no prompting, what would you search for if a friend came to you and said, should I vaccinate my child? And as you can see, the number of different search strings people use is pretty eye-watering. And this is just in English, some of them, and these are from some of the other different languages. After we showed these the other day, Facebook, Pinterest, and Google all asked for these search strings, which kind of floored me for a second. And it made me realize that these companies have oceans of data, but they're not set up to capture and understand the ways people actually search for these types of topics. And so finding a way that we could simply build a tool for people to be prompted to ask what they would search for would give us this incredible data set of search strings. So just imagine what we would learn if we built out this global network of concerned citizens who wanted to donate their social data to science. We would finally be able to examine how different algorithms impact what information we see in our feeds. One of the major trends we're seeing is a chilling effect on speech. There is a move away from the Facebook newsfeed into encrypted spaces, whether that's Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, or Telegram. This is already happening. It's why Zuckerberg is talking about this pivot to privacy. We've seen it in places like Russia and Indonesia and Brazil and Singapore as a result of the regulation being passed in these spaces. I'm a firm advocate for the need for encrypted spaces, but they do pose real challenges when it comes to the spread of false and misleading information. The only way to understand what's in these groups is to build a community of concerned citizens who want to act as an early warning mechanism to protect their communities. They can work with journalists, researchers, and fact-checkers to flag potentially false content so it can be investigated. These people then can act as central nodes of influence in their own offline communities, teaching others and spreading quality information. Because these platforms are the opposite of the open web. There is no broadcast functionality. It's mostly one-to-one communication or small group communications. There's no way for quality media to share quality information in spaces like WhatsApp. It relies on people to do the spreading. This is why we have to properly engage the community, make them part of the solution. This isn't passive media literacy classes involving PowerPoint slides and an interactive game at the end. This is going to be an ongoing attempt to engage the public in being part of the solution. Another example is the project I mentioned that we ran in Brazil called Comprova. We had this central WhatsApp number and received over 250,000 messages. That means we have the world's biggest data set of misinformation on WhatsApp. But now there are issues about what we need to do to create frameworks around it. What are the ethics of me sharing this type of data with other researchers? Can I share the data? It's come from encrypted spaces. We have the ability to really learn from these type of data sets. We're not going to get the data from the platforms, but how do we work with concerned citizens and build ethical frameworks to enable us to do the work that we need to on that data? A database would provide so many things. It would help act as a check when platforms say they've rolled out changes, when we'd be able to do some community auditing. It would act as an independent check when people say they flagged content but nothing has happened to it. The platforms haven't taken a decision. And we know almost nothing about how different types of disinformation and hate impact attitudes and behaviors over time. We haven't even started doing the longitudinal analysis that we need to do. And almost all of the research on these issues has been done in the US, though the problem is global. So micro-volunteerism, this is Galaxy Zoo. I don't know if you've ever been on it. It's a crowdsourced astronomy project. It's a platform that allows people to help with the classification of galaxies. There are many, many, many examples out here. But what would it look like in our space of information quality? Could we get people to classify different types of speech so that we could understand how people think about different examples around the world and what they think should stay up or be taken down? Could we train people to verify different types of content they're seeing in different spaces online so we could start to understand patterns of content and campaigns that are being used around the world? The process of classifying would also be the world's largest information literacy project, as the process of verifying would be a way of teaching these skills. And could we get them to investigate news sources around the world? Who funds them? Is there a corrections policy on the site? Do they label news versus opinion? If this was designed properly, not only would we be able to scale up some of the credibility ratings projects that exist right now, but are struggling with claims of bias themselves, it would be a dynamic, interactive news literacy project. And finally, getting people to take part in experiments. I hope many of you know the work of Nathan Matthias and Civil Servant. They do amazing work with communities, including Wikipedia, to test out interventions in the wild. So much of what we know about the ways in which people interact with information has been carried out by political and social psychologists who've been running experiments, mostly with American undergraduates in laboratories. Could we design ways so that we can test and replicate these studies online in the wild to test whether interventions like flags, nutritional labels, or more nudges, e.g. don't share until you've waited 2 minutes, might work? So I'm a big proponent of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Rather than trying to design the perfect solution, let's try some things out for size. Let's prototype, let's test, and let's start again. Finally, we have to connect the dots. No one sector, and certainly no one startup, nonprofit, or government is going to solve this. Wearing my first draft hat, we pioneered the cross-check model, where newsrooms worked collaboratively to investigate information disorder, with newsrooms understanding that when it comes to these issues, it doesn't make sense to be competitive. So there are very smart people around the world working on these issues, and many of you are in the room today, from academia, civil society, activist groups, and newsrooms. Unfortunately, for the most part, each effort is in its own silo, and many are woefully underfunded. There are also hundreds of people working on these challenges at the tech companies, but their efforts can also feel disjointed as they're designing different responses to the same problems. The project I'm now working on with Alexios, Civic, is designed to connect and amplify such efforts. It's one attempt to find ways to coordinate the lessons from these different organizations and to connect them to the many different people around the world who care deeply about building an infrastructure for quality information. But this isn't about more email listservs or Slack communities. We need to physically bring people together in one location for days or weeks at a time so these problems can be tackled from different perspectives. TED has a residency program, and from June 1st is going to be a residency program for Civic. There are 22 desks and plenty of meeting room space. We'll be running sprints this summer. Each Tuesday in June, we'll kick off a workshop, and then we hope people will spend the summer working collaboratively. Some might be able to stay for just the day, some might be for 2 weeks, some might be for 3 months. We want to identify problem areas. We want different people from different perspectives to come and work side by side for a distinct period of time, a time that will end with a prototype. It might be a piece of code, a policy framework, an intervention to build friction into sharing, or an educational resource. Can we design a system where people safely flag content that they deem as potentially suspicious or downright dangerous? We need to work together to figure out the threats of gaming, but what might be possible? What does an open system for crowdsourced verification look like? What would an aggregated score for certain trustworthy sources of information look like? There are so many questions to answer and prototypes to work on. Every week, we'll open up the space for lunch so anybody who happens to be in New York can come and hear the residents explain what they've been working on so the wider community can provide mentorship, guidance, and feedback. And what is crucial is that we evaluate at the end of this which projects are at a point which need more funding, support from a platform or other organization that could turn a prototype into something that could really make a difference. So if you're interested or you have staff in your organization or department that you think you could spare, or if you have postdocs who are looking for something to do this summer, please go to civiccentral.org and express your interest in part of this, because we really have to do something about this. It's been 3 years, and I think it's really difficult for any of us to look in the mirror and say that we've really made any substantial changes on these challenges of information disorder. Because we need a coordinated, ambitious response, one that matches the complexity and the scale of the problem. Together, let's reclaim our information commons by recognizing the complexity of the problem and working collectively on building long-term resiliency and finding ways to bring the public into these processes. Thank you. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. I think there are 2 microphones if you do.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question. Your argument is the community should collaborate and identify rumors and squash them down. Do we want to allocate some mass of probability for the possibility the community is wrong? And I want to take you back. I mean, fake news are not new in history, right? I want to take you back to early 17th century when an Italian guy was spreading ridiculous fake news. And he was tried, and the news were found to be untrue, and he was forbidden to spread it anymore. His name is Galileo. He was tried by Inquisition for spreading news of heliocentrism, which we all believe to be true today. What is the community is wrong today?
So I think part of the issue here is that we like to obsess with what's true or false, and what we're talking about here is context. And so my fear is if we have certain people who we appoint as fact checkers, or we say that certain people are these gatekeepers, then we're actually losing the credibility of portions of the public who are struggling with this. The idea of bringing in more voices is not to say that you can tick this and say it's yes, but in the model of Wikipedia, what right now can we use in terms of transparency and evidence around something to provide that context? So yes, it's not saying that it's the answer, but I don't think we have the answer right now, and I think the absence of the public is just as problematic.
But do you think it should be squashed once and for all based on the current knowledge available, or should we allow for the possibility this knowledge will be reversed in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of when people sometimes are critical of fact checkers, they say, well, the evidence shows that fact checkers don't change people's minds. Well, actually, for me, the reason that fact checkers exist is so that we can have a public record of what was actually said. And so I think in this context, it's not saying that anything should be squashed. You know, those people who work in this space, we have this thing called zombie rumors that just won't die. And so it's not a case of saying, if enough people do it, we're going to squash it. It's about having more people in this conversation. And it might be simply a case of, you know, as Facebook makes a decision, it's not about removal, it's about de-ranking. So I think this problem is so complex. And I think at the moment we're using older versions of gatekeeping as a way of thinking about information. And I think, what does it look like if we bring more people in to actually provide that complexity? But yes, there are so many challenges with this. It is tempting to go and sit under the duvet, but...
Thank you.
I think we have to try something.
Hey, thanks for the cool talk. It was very interesting. I do appreciate that. So I'm thinking that the problem of fake news has always existed. It's just that with the social media and the internet, it gets amplified, and our weaknesses get amplified. So I'm thinking that the pictures that you showed, like of this woman walking by the victim or the immigrant attacking the nurse, whatever it was, whether true or not, this has always existed. And the problem is that for every such picture, I can find 10 pictures where a non-immigrant attacks an immigrant, right? So isn't the problem rather that we should educate people to not take every single picture, even if it is true, as evidence of their own theory. I think there is the problem in this interpretation, not in the sharing of the picture. What do you think?
Yeah, and that's why I keep talking about resiliency, is that we haven't done a good enough job of explaining to people that when you're standing in line for coffee and you see an image, if we don't teach emotional skepticism, we're being used as weapons against ourselves. So the resiliency is not, we don't need more media literacy to say, is this a headline? Is this an op-ed? How do you do a reverse image search? It's about saying, if you see content that makes you have an emotional reaction, it either makes you angry or fearful, stop and think about why you're resharing it. So I think the resiliency piece is what we have to do. And thinking globally, where we have many communities who've never had an email address and have gone straight to phones, but are incredibly trusting because they've got these fancy phones. Something that's on a fancy phone, why would that not be true? So we fail to really think about what media literacy looks like in this context, and we've fallen back into older media literacy curriculum, and we haven't said, what do we do now to build resiliency for all those things, which is the only solution here is about the public and educating the public. And part of the reason of trying to bring them in is, my fear is that the conversations right now about the public are very paternalistic. But making people part of this, I'm hoping, will make them recognize the complexity by doing something as opposed to just passively receiving information. But I couldn't agree more. And I would say when people started worrying about this, some people said, what about building resiliency in the public? And everybody said, that will take too long. What we need is an algorithmic tweak. And I think 3 years on, everybody's like, oh, that algorithmic tweak isn't going to happen. And really, we have to recognize we need 30 years of resiliency training. Because it's not just for children. You probably saw this research. The people who are most likely to share misinformation are older white men. So,
thank you.
Yeah. There's none of those people here.
All white men to the mics. We can take a couple of more questions. There are 2 mics in the back.
Hi there. I love the idea of Galaxy Zoo. As an astronomer, I love the idea of Galaxy Zoo for news. One problem here that we may have, one obstacle to overcome, I suppose, is that Galaxy Zoo was the quintessential gamification of science. It was so much fun, and there was no context outside what people were doing of politics.
Yeah.
So how do we overcome this huge obstacle?
And that's partly why, for the beginning, trying to get people to do things like classify speech. I mean, let's talk about regulation for a second. What we're seeing is separate governments thinking about regulation, but this is actually a really big global problem. And I think what we haven't understood is it possible to have one standard for speech? Or actually, are there different parts of the world you say, no, I want to dial, and for example, we know this in Germany, they don't allow any Nazi-related content on Twitter. And so one of the pieces I'm interested in terms of classifying speech is getting people to just kind of give a sense, a kind of a gut reaction of how they respond to certain things as a data set. So I think one of the things I think about micro-volunteerism is just helping us get a whole load of different types of data and then making a decision about what we could safely do or what would work with the public in a kind of a more Galaxy Zoo way. But I do think it's a powerful way of just getting a sense from people about what decisions they would like to see.
Absolutely brilliant. And then, of course, you carry on and use that as a training set for something that's more scalable.
Yeah, because, all the engineers in the room, the problem we have with all the interventions right now is very well-meaning non-profits doing things like tagging the credibility of a news site, but they've got data sets of, 200. And engineers need much bigger data sets. So that's the other way that if we can scale this, could we do something amazing?
Brilliant, thanks.
Hi, Claire. Thank you for the keynote. So I have a question. So we developed a platform where users can donate their ads, and we are trying to bring more transparency to understand who are these advertisers and what are the message in their ads. And my question for you was that we are trying to build a bigger user base. And I was wondering whether you have any advice on how to incentivize people to install the tool so we can get a better view.
And which country are you doing this in?
So I'm from France, but we also did it in Brazil. We collected some users, and it's worldwide development. Is not specific to a country.
Oh, great. Well, also, we should talk afterwards because I want to connect you with some people. But the real question here is, how do we amplify this? So, for example, in Brazil, when we had the cross-check project, we actually had 24 of the largest Brazilian newsrooms. So the reason that we got so many messages from WhatsApp is because you had 24 very large newsrooms pushing out the same telephone number. So I think there's a question here is like, how can we adopt news organizations, but also think about other communities? So if we're thinking about 2020 in the US, how can we reach different communities? And that's about church groups, that's about other activist groups, that's about thinking about how can we reach different communities who don't normally install plugins? Because ProPublica, we love ProPublica, but ProPublica's audience is particularly to the left. So all the ads they were getting in were from people who were particular. So then they started paying for Facebook ads so they could actually reach more conservative readers, and that changed things. So I think thinking strategically about where are those amplification organizations, and some of them are going to be newsrooms, but not only newsrooms, because there are big swathes of the population who no longer trust the mainstream media. So we have to think about different things. But no, I would love to talk to you after about some of these things.
Okay, I will come by. Thank you.
So it feels like the solutions/directions that you've been discussing kind of operate on this, what I'm calling a what kind of level, where you have a lot of maybe data points of some form where they're tagged as either, true in some sense or not true. But it seems to me that you'd have a lot of people who could just kind of systematically deny that in the same way that they do, and they wouldn't be unreasonable. And so I'm kind of wondering, what would a why approach look like, where your data kind of had structure that showed not just here is what we think is true, it's here is how all of the evidence and other things that we know point to why we think that's true.
No, you're spot on. It's, I talked about the weaponization of context. Right now, we're obsessed with what's true or false, or this fuzzy middle of misleading. And what we're not providing is the wider context of, once you know that tweet was from a Russian disinformation bot, it changes that. So I think so much of what we don't know right now is the why, and we haven't got mechanisms because structure and databases are around the things that we can, there's no subjectivity. And unfortunately, there's a lot of subjectivity here. So the structure you're talking about is how can we build structure around subjectivity and context? And I'd say that's where we need to go. And one of the reasons for doing these talks and throwing these examples up is I think too often when I go and talk to students, they're still obsessed with the true or false. And I think what we need to do is these data sets of the middle to say that's what we really need to be focusing on, because we're getting much better at the automated fact-checking of the true and false. What we can't deal with is the why. But I haven't thought about it in those terms, but I shall use that from now on, because that's very smart. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for the great talk. It's a topic close to my heart. I'm part of a bunch of WhatsApp groups where I get these messages, and I'm the fact checker of most of those groups. So I know I keep bashing them. The phenomenon I see is in those groups, I see fewer of those messages trickling to me. Like the friends and family, they have started selecting what messages they forward in the groups because they know, this is suspicious, so I might get bashed. Is this a widespread phenomenon, like the fact-checking resistance? So you don't send to groups where you think there are fact-checkers sitting. You just, people don't like fact-checking, I think. Is this a widespread phenomenon? What do you think? Yeah,
it's a human phenomenon. People don't like to be told that they're wrong. So you're absolutely right, which is, we all struggle with confirmation bias. So for example, this example gets used a lot, but if you're scrolling through and you see a piece about Obama sending illegal immigrants back, from the left, you want to scroll past that because you don't want to read it because it doesn't support your worldview. So it's not a right or, it's a human thing. But to your point, we have seen that too, which is there are more people now getting active in WhatsApp groups with their families, and they're seeing their families mute them or kick them out. So in a place like Brazil, that we did a lot of work, it's really sad to see the same kind of things happening as we saw in the US, which is families being torn apart because people don't want information that challenges them. So that's the biggest problem we have in all of this.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is that, so people hear about rumors and hearsay, that's just something kind of normal in our daily lives. But the thing that when those kind of questionable information come into web, people start to kind of question why so. Is that a case that people kind of assign a more trust to something be written than something be heard? And then when those information come to the web and people get maybe confused, what do you think about that? Because to some extent, if you believe that in our daily life, rumors are kind of normal, maybe those questionable information start showing on the web is kind of a truthful representation of our daily life.
Yeah, I mean, I think this formats question about text versus video versus audio is really interesting, which is trying to understand how people think about credibility. And one of the challenges in a WhatsApp group is there are very few heuristics, those mental shortcuts. So you don't even see who it's forwarded from, you don't see where it's come from. And so the only heuristic you have is it's from your best friend or from your mum, and so you're much more trusting of that. So to your point, we have so much to learn about credibility when it's about different types of rumors. We've focused so much on news credibility, like do people trust the New York Times or the Washington Post? We've done a lot less on how credibility works in the online space, particularly text, image, or video. So yeah.
10 seconds for the last question.
Okay, I'll try really quick. So to me, this fact-checking and the problem that we're trying to solve feels a little bit like helping victims after the terror attack, because that seems like it's not possible to do it, just handle the results. What do you think about actually solving the problem by going to the source? And like if we know that there is a source that's disseminating this, then there has to be active action taken, not maybe on an information level, but on a military level. So like if we knew that, when we knew that Al-Qaeda was doing things, that people went after Al-Qaeda. If we know that there is an entity that is responsible for all of this, why isn't it just a solution to take measures in other fields?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that we struggle with is that the way that Russia used Facebook was the way that Facebook was designed to be used. So it's very difficult often to know who's behind this. Facebook is getting much better at this, and yesterday you might have seen they took down a huge amount of networks from Israel that were targeting African countries. And when you read that, you just think this is the tip of the iceberg, because it's so easy for anybody to pretend to be somebody else and to influence. And so to your point, yes, yes, yes. The challenge is, again, because the data is locked up in Facebook, we have to assume that Facebook are looking and the rest of us can't do anything about it. But yes, and rather than thinking about regulating or taking down content, we should be thinking about regulating and taking down behaviors. But it's much harder to get access to data that shows us those behaviors.
Let's thank Claire.
Yes.
Make the announcement. Let me. So here is where we need your help. All of you who are sitting in the back, please move forward. Everybody who's sitting on the two sides, please come to the center. If you are one of the organizers, volunteers,